Hello and welcome to another episode of Entry Level Esports. I'm your host Trent, and this week I want to talk about something that has come up since the Western Clash. We saw Zealots make an incredible run at the Western Clash with an unsponsored team. They have no esports organization that they're affiliated with. They made this incredible run all the way to second place, very nearly taking out Team Dignitas. And we saw a lot of social media activity saying that they need to go ahead and get sponsored, that they have value to a team, and someone needs to pick them up right away. And so I wanted to quickly kind of talk about the state of investment risk in Heroes of the Storm, and then use that to talk about one of the ways I think that Blizzard and the HGC can most quickly and effectively fix some of those challenges, and that is the subject of relegation. And it's a very controversial topic. A lot of people are really in favor of relegation. A lot of people really dislike relegation. A lot of people don't even know what the term relegation means. So we're going to get into all of that very quickly. Before we do all of that, I just want to kind of set the tone for the reality of Heroes of the Storm in the global esports landscape. For the past about year and a half, I have been working as a freelance writer for larger esports organizations, including HGC Esports. I've reached out to a wide range of sponsors, investors, and news coverage outlets to write about Heroes of the Storm, and they have consistently accepted articles from me about fighting games, about Overwatch, about Paladins, but they have consistently rejected article pitches about Heroes of the Storm. And this is also reflected in the opinion and attitude of major esports organizations when it comes to investing in and signing currently free agent Heroes of the Storm teams. And the reality of the situation is that top-tier esports organizations, both content and team sponsorship, just do not care about Heroes of the Storm. It's not that they think the game is bad. It's not that they think the game is not an esport, or any of the criticisms that we see from League of Legends fans and Dota 2 fans when they come into Reddit and talk about how the game is for casuals. It has nothing to do with that. The game just literally isn't on the radar of the majority of top-tier esports teams to even consider investing in. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is the very poor stream numbers. Both individual streamers and the HGC as a whole perform very poorly on Twitch. They usually average somewhere between 9,000 and 15,000 viewers on a given week. The Western Clash did a little bit better than that, but still just pales in comparison to most esports of the same caliber as Heroes of the Storm. So Heroes of the Storm is kind of in the top of the third tier of esports, but it just doesn't even come close to tier 1, tier 2 in terms of streaming numbers. There's also a lack of advertisement from Blizzard. The HGC is not in the client to be able to be viewed. It's not being focused on. We're not telling the stories of players and highlighting them in most Blizzard promotional content like we are with the Overwatch League, which is where pretty much all of Blizzard's focus is right now. So there's just not a ton of really active, aggressive promotion from Blizzard for the HGC right now. There's a severe lack of LANs, which is one of the biggest opportunities for teams to get their brand out there, to sell sponsorship on their jerseys and with their logo, because you will actually see the players in their jerseys. You'll get one-on-one interviews with the players in their jerseys. You'll get to hear the names talked about more frequently over the course of a weekend. There's a bigger spotlight on LAN events, so the viewer numbers go up, and there's only 3 to 4 LANs a year for a given team, and even then, only the top 3 to 4 teams actually qualify from a region, so that makes it basically unattractive to sign anyone but like the top 2 teams that are guaranteed to go to a LAN, because there's so few LANs, and even the ones that you can go to, most likely your team isn't going to qualify. There's also just a massive lack of community support. The overwhelming majority of Heroes of the Storm players just don't care about esports. You look at the view numbers on YouTube for content, for the average podcast, for Heroes Hearth articles written even by professional players. You look at follower numbers on Twitter and Instagram for Heroes of the Storm pros. You look at just Reddit comments in general. The vast majority of Heroes of the Storm players are casual players who play quick match and nothing else, or they play a little bit of Hero League, but they do not focus on watching esports for entertainment or to learn how to get better at the game. You also have to sponsor a whole team. It's much more difficult to choose to sign a Heroes of the Storm team than it is to sign a Super Smash Bros. Player or a Street Fighter player, because then you're only signing one person. You only have to pay one salary, as opposed to having to pay 5 salaries and buy 5 plane tickets and buy 5 computer setups and do all of these things. It just increases the cost of the investment. And so when you have an esport that's in the same tier as a number of individual esports, it just makes much more sense to sign a team for something smaller, like even Rocket League. Rocket League does a little bit better than Heroes of the Storm, but not by much, and individual streaming numbers are actually a little bit lower, but you only have to sign 3 players as opposed to 5, so it's a much cheaper investment to get a mid-tier Rocket League team than it would be to get a Heroes of the Storm team if you're paying the same salary for both, because there's just fewer players. So all of these things make Heroes of the Storm just less attractive to investors than other esports in the same tier or higher. But one of the biggest challenges that comes up is the concept of relegation. And when we talk about relegation, we're talking about the crucible, the fact that the bottom 2 teams are eliminated from the league and have to re-qualify for their spot by defeating an open division team that challenges them. And if they fail, they're completely removed from the league. Every single one of those players is kicked out of the league. That brand is kicked out of the league. And those players are left to fend for themselves, potentially find a spot on another team. But for the most part, they're just gone. And especially that brand is gone. If Team Dignitas suddenly just had a horrible second half of the year and got relegated, Team Dignitas would no longer be a part of the HGC. Some new team, like Team Good Guys, would come back in and take their spot, and that brand would be a part of the HGC, and Team Dignitas, the organization, would be gone. And relegation is something that organizations and sponsors take the threat of very, very seriously. We saw this in the North American LCS. It's one of the reasons that all of the owners of LCS teams pushed so hard for a franchise model that removed relegation. Because even teams like Team Solo Mid, who were consistently at the top of the standings and were basically never in danger of getting relegated, hated the relegation model because it scared away sponsors. So one of the things that I've pushed for Heroes of the Storm teams to do is, rather than try to sign with a mid-tier esports organization, go get a title sponsor with a brand deal. Do something like Roll20 Esports, but rather than being owned by Roll20, sell your naming rights, sell a brand deal, the players play Dungeons and Dragons, or all of our players use Razer keyboards, or we all drink Red Bull energy drinks, and you promote that in your after game interviews. You change the team name to Red Bull Zealots or whatever it is. The problem with doing that in Heroes of the Storm is, because we have this relegation model, a lot of investors and sponsors just don't want anything to do with this kind of model, because there's always that threat that their investment gets wasted because a team becomes relegated. And players and fans just aren't going to invest in a low-end team the way they will a top-end team, because that threat of relegation exists. You're not going to buy a bunch of leftovers jerseys if you think that in 6 weeks, they're not going to be a part of the league anymore. You're not going to be invested in any brand that they're trying to sell because they're just going to be gone soon. And so, and this happened in the North American LCS. Even, like I said, Team Solo Mid really struggled to find sponsors because sponsors just didn't want to mess with a system that had relegation as an option and a threat. They just didn't want to take that risk. And you can say that like a team like Dignitas or Fnatic is going to be safe from that, or like Zealots even is super unlikely to be relegated. But in the LCS, we saw Team Liquid just a couple years ago be relegated. They had to fight their way back through the Challenger Series in a relegation match fighting against an open division team. And if they had lost that, Team Liquid would not have been a part of the NALCS anymore. And they were a huge brand in the LCS that had a bunch of sponsors, that had a bunch of clout in the scene, that very nearly lost their spot, and all of their sponsors lost their chance to advertise in the LCS. So just the fact that relegation exists makes it very unattractive for teams to take a risk on an esport, especially an esport like Heroes of the Storm that has so many other factors making it not an attractive investment. So you pile on all those other risk factors on top of one of the most proven risk factors in esports in the relegation model, and it just makes it very hard to sell Heroes of the Storm to an investor, no matter what your results are. On top of that, HOTS is just not seeing explosive growth, but it has potential. There's a lot of players in Heroes of the Storm, and every time Blizzard does a cross-promotion with another game, we get more players that stick around. We've had when the Oni Genji promotion went on. We had so many Reddit threads about, I checked this out just to get the skin and now I'm playing every day. We saw Reddit traffic and Reddit subscribers boom during that time, and it dipped a little bit, but it stayed higher than it had before. So every time Blizzard does one of these promotions, we get new players into Heroes of the Storm. The challenge right now is, like we said before, so many of those players just don't care about the HGC. But if Blizzard and the community figure out how to convert some of those existing players into active esports fans, we could suddenly see overnight explosive growth for the HGC and for Heroes of the Storm esports as a whole. And so what Blizzard and the HGC really need is they need long-term partners who can invest in Heroes of the Storm now and work with Blizzard to grow the scene and to grow entrenched fans out of existing players, so that at some point HGC can explode in viewership growth and engagement because we've converted more casual players into esports viewers. However, to do this, like I said, we need long-term partners, and you're not going to get long-term partners when you have the threat of relegation sitting there for the lower-end teams. We're probably going to have Fnatic and Dignitas sticking around for a while. We're probably going to have Tempo Storm and Team Freedom sticking around for a while. But if at any point any of those teams were to get relegated, they most likely would not reinvest. And we've seen this over and over again in every system that has relegation. When a team disbands, when a team gets relegated, that organization steps away and does not come back. Or if they do, it takes a long time before they come back. So we still are sitting here at any point with the risk of at some point our biggest organizations disappearing from the league if they have a down season and get relegated. So if we want to focus on long-term steady growth for Heroes of the Storm and converting existing players into esports fans, the easiest way for us to do this is to eliminate relegation. Because if we eliminate relegation, it immediately forces every team to be owned by a sponsor. There's going to be a lot of teams and organizations that sign on and are willing to take that risk. We've seen that with the NALCS having over 100 teams apply to be an LCS partner. We've seen that with how high the investment for the Overwatch League, which was incredibly unproven and was almost as bad an esport as Heroes of the Storm in terms of esports landscape viewership, community engagement. Franchise models are attractive to esports orgs. We know this to be true. We've seen it too many times now to doubt. So we would absolutely get investment from multiple esports organizations that were looking at a long-term play and were willing to grow with the league. So if we took on a franchise model, we immediately get every single team sponsored by an esports organization. We immediately get permanent partners that are invested in long-term growth for the scene. And we eliminate the risk for players. And we're going to talk through some of those advantages a little bit more in detail in a moment. But first, I want to very quickly remove some of the comments that are already being typed right now by European fans who are saying that they hate the idea of a franchise model. It's not how traditional sports work in Europe. It's not beneficial for the viewers. It hurts the landscape of the esports scene. We already have an amateur scene that feeds into the pro scene. Having relegation ensures that the best teams are playing, and it creates more drama for the bottom end of the scene so that those games are more interesting. And all of those things are true to a degree, but you cannot use European football leagues as a reliable comparison for esports for the sole reason of parachute payments. When a football club gets relegated out of the top tier league in Europe, they are given a share of TV revenue as a parachute payment when they get sent down to the lower league. Also, there is a lower league. So these two things together make it so that you have a healthier ecosystem that covers the risk of relegation for teams and clubs, because they can stay together as a brand because they're getting this major, basically, exit fee for being relegated out of the league, and they have enough capital to stay afloat, to rebuild and restructure and keep their fan base and keep their marketing going and pay all of their support staff and their players as they transition down to the lower league and potentially try to earn their way back up. In esports, when a team gets relegated, most of the time they disband. They disband, the organization leaves the scene, and the players are left to fend for themselves. There is no such thing as a parachute payment, and there's not going to be such a thing as a parachute payment. Blizzard and most esports franchise or non-franchise models lose money on their esports, and they use it as a marketing tool. They don't have TV deals and revenue sharing models that allow brands to receive those parachute payments. That model just doesn't exist, and it's not going to. It's not practical for Blizzard and the HGC to introduce a parachute payment model. So that's not going to exist, and so all of the ways that a relegation model works in traditional sports in Europe just simply does not apply to esports and to the HGC. So let's very quickly look through some of the ways that a removal of relegation would be beneficial for everybody. It's great for the organizations, obviously. It's a safer investment. HOTS can be a long-term investment for even the lower-end teams. Weaker teams can still focus on growing a following. They can invest long-term in building a roster slowly, in building a roster around one or two stars. They can market those stars. They can build a following. It just is a safer, smarter investment all the way around. And it makes the HGC more attractive to teams that did not have it on their radar because it makes them a permanent partner with one of the biggest companies in gaming. Blizzard is huge and is owned in part by Activision. So you're immediately getting a foothold in with Activision Blizzard, one of the titans of the esports and gaming industry, which is one of the reasons why the Overwatch League was so attractive to so many major investors, because it made you a permanent partner with Blizzard Entertainment long term. That would be an opportunity again for these major esports organizations that didn't get into the Overwatch League to get a foothold way cheaper than they did in the Overwatch League into Heroes of the Storm. It's a fantastic system for players. No more relegation means that there isn't relegation, so you won't be relegated. It means that you have a more stable career. You can grow with your organization, transition out of being a player into being a coach or being an analyst or being a streamer for that team, because that team is always going to be around. And you're not in danger of losing your position in the league despite playing well. Somebody has to be in 8th place. That's the biggest problem with a relegation system. There's always a loser in every single game, which means some team is going to be in last place, even if they perform reasonably well and don't go like 0-1,000 in the season. They still might get relegated because there might be a decent open division team that catches them on a bad day, and they just happen to be the 8th place team. So your spot in the league, as long as you play well and have a good relationship with your organization, you're going to have a career in the HGC. Also, you won't get relegated. Relegation sucks for players. It makes the entire season scarier. It makes quitting your job or school to focus on HGC a way riskier proposition, because you might just lose it 6 months later. So removing relegation is phenomenal for players, and it's great for fans. Organizations will never leave. The same organizations are going to be there year after year after year after year. So if you invest in Roll20, you have no danger of them suddenly not being a part of the league because they couldn't come to an ownership agreement with the players and your jersey suddenly not meaning anything. You can buy a Space Station gaming jersey and know that next year you're going to be able to cheer for Space Station, and the year after that you're going to be able to cheer for Space Station, and there's no fear that suddenly Space Station is going to be gone. Teams can build long term instead of blowing up their roster because they have to win right now. In Heroes of the Storm right now, for Heroes to make sense as an investment for an esports organization, you have to win right now. The only way you make money in Heroes of the Storm is to win. And so you have to get a competitive roster right now. You can't afford to have a rebuilding year like you can in traditional sports. So you're always going to see these roster apocalypse situations so long as relegation exists. If relegation goes away, teams can more safely invest in players long term. They can sign more long-term deals with their players, and they can build their roster long term so that you can safely invest in being a fan of Jay Schritta on Space Station without that suddenly disappearing. Because most likely he's going to stay on that team, and that team is going to stay in the league even if they end up in last place. And you can invest in a team regardless of results. You can be an LFM fan and be a diehard LFM fan and know that LFM is going to be there next year, and they might be a better team. And there are fans that love rooting for the underdog and love the satisfaction of supporting their team for years and years and years and then finally seeing them succeed. That's a wonderful sports journey that we don't get in a relegation model. Now, the biggest criticism of a franchise model is always that teams at the bottom won't try as hard. There's no incentive for a team that's losing every single game to focus on doing better. And that's true to a degree from the organization standpoint, in that organizations aren't punished necessarily for consistently making bad decisions. You look at the Detroit Lions or the Cleveland Browns in American football, they consistently make stupid decisions. They consistently draft the wrong players, and they're consistently at the bottom of the league year after year after year after year after year. But those players still try to win every single game. So the idea that in a franchise model, teams will give up, or they'll start picking stupid things, or those games won't be as competitive at the end of the season, just isn't true, because those players are fighting for their jobs, and there's fewer of them, so slacking off is going to be way more obvious than it would be in a 53-man roster on a football team. You're not try to tell Jay Schritta or Equinox that they're not going to try as hard at the end of a season because they're not in danger of losing their job immediately. They're still in danger of losing their job immediately if their team is in last place, because there's lots of talented players in the open division that want their job right now, and there's players in Latin America and Australia that are willing to relocate and uproot their lives to take their job. So you're always going to see players fighting as hard as they can to keep their job and to win games, because losing sucks and losing your job sucks. To the point of organizations consistently making stupid moves that keep them at the bottom of the league. There are lots of ways to prevent that. You can put in incentive structures in your revenue sharing model. You can get rid of people in your organization that are causing your team to lose and making bad decisions and replace them with smarter people. There are ways to combat that. But again, some team has to be at the bottom. So there's always going to be an 8th place team, and that's okay. 8th place teams can still have value, can still have fans, and can over time improve their roster and become better and have success. So I don't see that as enough of a downside to counteract all of the ways that removing relegation would instantly make the HGC more attractive, more popular, and more monetarily successful. So Blizzard and the HOTS community have a ton of work to do to make HOTS relevant in terms of esports. Right now, it's mostly a punchline in terms of the broader esports landscape. To get rid of that, we need to overhaul the community, focus on bringing in existing players. Blizzard needs to do more to sell stars and to sell the competitive nature of Heroes of the Storm. They need to overhaul so many things within the game to make the game more attractive to players as a competitive title. But removing relegation would kickstart that process. It would stabilize the esports landscape as they fix all of these other things. And it would guarantee that Blizzard would achieve its stated goal for 2018 of having every single team sponsored by an esports organization. Right now, I frankly don't see that happening in 2018. As I look at the esports landscape and I look at the other games that are passing Heroes of the Storm and are becoming more profitable and more attractive to top-tier organizations, and the risk to free agent teams of giving away their ownership rights to a middle-tier or low-tier organization that's not going to pay them more than $500 a month salary, I just don't see every team signing with an esports organization unless you remove relegation, you move to a franchise model, and you sign long-term permanent partnerships with high-shelf esports organizations that are going to build and grow Heroes of the Storm alongside Blizzard for the next 5 to 10 years. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Entry Level Esports. If you want to stay up to date with what's going on with Trolls GG and Entry Level Esports, be sure to subscribe to this YouTube channel and follow me at Trent_Esports for updates and opinions, or to tell me why I'm horribly wrong about everything. So until then, I will see you next week.